Let's begin with a poet. John Donne, England's laureate of death, imagines his transition from this world to the next as a musical preparation, the heavenly afterlife as a musical performance. He writes, "Since I am coming to that holy room where, with thy choirs of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music, as I come, I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before." If Donne thinks of the next world as musical and of the soul as an instrument, the musician and historian Roger North celebrates music's power for good on earth. There is a splendid science called music, he observes, wherein the learned and unlearned have their parts, either to hear or practice, and all humankind now are, and ever since the creation of the world, have been and will be rejoicers in the noble fruits of it. And the practice ever was a symptom of good and never of evil to humankind. An English middle class arose in the 16th century, generated by the cultural and economic opportunities of the Protestant Reformation. That new middle class was a consumer class, one that could spend its increasing disposable income on music, on instruments, songbooks, training, and so on, and on that most precious commodity, free time to make music. I think that there's a link between music and consumerism, and it's pretty clear in this, I'm afraid not very clear slide of a still life by Peter Klaas, delicious foods, expensive foods, and beautifully made musical instruments. In musical fashion, royalty led the way, of course. The Tudors were great patrons and musical enthusiasts. Here's Henry VIII playing his harp in the 1530s. Elizabeth I played the lute and the virginals, and both supported court musicians, setting a pattern for their Stuart successors. We've just heard the early Elizabethan Robert Parsons, the song called Trumpets, with its fanfare-like brightness, very characteristic of the Tudor dynasty's love of spectacle and displays of power. Music helped create what we might call the spin of royal glamour and majesty. But it was not only the royal court, or cathedrals or colleges, but also family groups and individuals who supported the lively and burgeoning English music sector. Music had come into the home, where amateur musicians delighted in family consorts. Composers now met this market with compositions appropriate to domestic players. The amateur instrument of choice in the 16th and much of the 17th century was the lute, an instrument with Middle Eastern origins. Its name comes from the Arabic al-ud, alut. And the fragment of Dowland that we just heard that opened the concert alludes to the fashionable lute and its plucked strings. The lute allowed the player to adopt striking and attractive poses, which I think we see here. And although keyboard instruments were in fact recommended for ladies because, as Roger North explains, it keeps their body in a better posture rather than the lute, which tends to make them crooked. That's his word. The lute was challenged also by the guitar, and especially by the harpsichord in the later 17th century, and the harpsichord particularly became the principal instrument for amateurs, as did the mixed or broken consort, in other words, a consort of different kinds of instruments, like that one. At the same time, the viol, in its different forms and sizes, and the consort music composed for groups of viols, is the precursor of the modern quartet of bowed stringed instruments and its repertoire. That was Browning, My Dear, by the mid-16th century composer Clement Woodcock, and it's part of a set of 10 variations on a popular song. We'll say more about popular songs a little later. That compiling of variations is key. So maybe the characteristic Renaissance mode in music and in literature is the anthology, the compilation, the collection. And humanist scholars beginning in the 15th century were eager to establish a mode of pedagogy in the grammar schools that would introduce young boys to a vast range of classical learning in the form of wise nuggets, classical tags, useful observations, remarks by the great Roman authorities, particularly Seneca, Cicero, Ovid, and Catullus. Children at school and scholars in their studies routinely compiled commonplace books. In other words, books of extracts, usually under thematic headings, because in the vita activa, or the life of doing, you might require guidance. For example, you're in a tricky situation with your boss who might happen to be a monarch. To deal with it, you resort to your commonplace book and to the section you've entitled De Mutabilitas Principii, of the waywardness of princes, full of helpful comments by Seneca and others on this very difficult subject. But commonplacing could also include observations and records, drawings, snippets of contemporary poetry by friends or by oneself. Here's an example. This is a page from a commonplace book whose owner has written some poems, and there are a number of poems here, but I've got it on the page that includes the body poem called A Challenge to His Mistress, in which the poet describes the description of a battle betwixt his shirt and her smock. So you can imagine. These are private, so they can be a little bit frank. And here, people swapped entries, like these emblems, from their commonplace books, as well as poetry and other snippets of things. And it's a bit like a very literary scrapbooking circle. Everyone, from the queen to the youngest schoolboy, made a commonplace book, which was a sign of accomplishment and worldliness. And musical commonplacing was just as vigorous as its literary counterpart. Just as a literary commonplace book is an eclectic assemblage, a typical musical manuscript in this form from 1578, as it happens, has been studied extensively by Zoe Weiss, who's playing today, playing the bass viol. And this manuscript, which was borrowed and copied out by Clement Woodcock, whose Browning, My Dear, we just heard, contains instrumental tunes, especially dances, French chansons, motets, Italian madrigals, pieces based on Latin liturgical works, including in nomines, like the one we're about to hear by Pickforth. And these compilations would have belonged to families, individual families, and that itself tells us a great deal. It tells us that concert music was a highly social form. Consort compilations circulated in manuscript among friends and families for copying and playing. Musical transition, in other words, is one of the most interesting cultural features of this period. So just as poets and playwrights knew each other, read each other's work, and quoted and alluded to it, so musical compilations quote each other through borrowing and copying to produce an intricate web of intertextual reference. And that intertextuality also occurs in many of the pieces performed this evening. They're based on well-known songs, like Browning, My Dear, or religious texts. And these instrumental works wordlessly allude to lyrics and language that are well-known. The intense sociability of consort playing is also signaled by this particular manuscript, the one that Zoe's studying, by its physical form. Now, this is not from her manuscript. We don't have a high enough resolution picture, but it's called a table book. And it's called that because it's written out so that it can be laid on a table with different parts facing in different directions for all the singers or players, who in turn are facing each other, almost as if they were at a meal or conversing together. So what we get here is a real sense of music in this period as the food of social interaction. Well, we're about to hear three genres that originated in the Tudor period but remained extremely popular throughout the 17th century and appeared in these compilations. The first, the fantasia, which is a kind of dance music, includes things like pavans, galliards, almains, and other types of airs. Some of these are written for actual dancing, but some are a bit more grave and abstract and designed for listening. And that kind of fantasia is represented here by the one composed by the Elizabethan Italian Alfonso Ferrabosco. And we'll hear the In Nomine, secondly, a form originating in a section of a mass by the great early Tudor composer John Taverner, and adapted for viol consorts and as instrumental pieces of great formal invention and variety. And LeStrange is going to play Pickforth's In Nomine right now. This is a work of about the 1560s. Finally, Taverner's Quemadmodum is, like the In Nomine, an adaptation of the sung liturgy. It's actually from Psalm 42, which begins, "As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God." The first of the two works we just heard, John Dowland's sublime Come Again of 1598, will be familiar to many of you in its vocal form with those lines that go, I sit, I sigh, I weep, I faint, I die in deadly pain and endless misery. And that is breathlessly rendered in this wonderful syncopated motif that you just heard. And not for nothing was the incomparable Dowland taken on by James I as his court lutenist. He provided superb songs and airs, but just as important, he gilded James's reputation as a cultural patron and leader of taste. If Dowland was in essence a composer of private solo works, Giovanni Caprario, real name plain old John Cooper, but pretentiously passing himself off as an Italian, Caprario composed that second piece we just heard as part of a grand wedding masque. And that represents the public or corporate face of royal grandeur. And it's masque music that occupies the next set of pieces. Now, we tasted Henry's magnificence in The Trumpets by Parsons. That was the second piece we heard this evening. The Tudor monarchs, especially Henry VIII and his daughter Elizabeth I, manipulated magnificence as a feature of royal power during the century-long fallout from the Reformation. Henry, early on, seizing religious power from the Pope and needing to stamp ungainsayable royal authority on all his subsequent acts. Elizabeth, dealing with chaos in 1558 when she ascended the throne, and a throne beset by constant religious shifts, an unruly church, and a population terrified and angered by her sister Mary's violent religious persecutions. James I, Elizabeth's successor, was the beneficiary of his aunt's 40 years of civil peacekeeping. But where Elizabeth had been parsimonious, James, by contrast, wasn't at all interested in penny pinching, and that's because he had spent a great deal of time in France. And he was influenced by the very different, really quite astonishing grandeur of continental courts, especially that of Henri IV and his queen Marie de Medici. Henri sponsored heroic architecture, the grand restoration of Paris and the Louvre, and the patronage of artists. Henri had also been a war hero. Now, James, as we know, was nothing of the kind, but he still conceived of the English monarchy as being on the same heroic scale. Where Elizabeth had had a gift for interacting with the common people and promoting talented nobodies to be her great ministers of state, James's court culture was an enclosed elite, and it was focused on aristocrats and on private and sumptuous entertainments. And the form that best represents that Jacobean elite culture is the masque. A curious blend, the masque is, of singing, consort music, dialogues, dancing, short dramas, and elaborate theatrical devices and machines, mainly produced by the incomparable Ben Jonson, who wrote the scripts, and Inigo Jones, who made the spectacles. And they usually included a mixture of royal, aristocratic, and professional actors and musicians. And the topic of any masque was likely to be some sort of compliment to the king or queen. We just heard first an air by John Adson, who produced theater music in the reigns of James and Charles and was a composer of consort dances. And then we heard Dowland's Earl of Essex Galliard, a version of a song very suggestively entitled, "Can She Excuse My Wrongs?" I'd like to know more about that. Now, these lively works were made for dancing, either by actors in masks or later by social dancers. In the masks as performed for the king at court by Jacobean and Caroline courtiers, the dancers could show off their skills before their monarch. And here we see a masking scene with its elaborate perspectival flats, which were a striking new technical innovation from the continent at this point. The complex imagery and staging of masks and its themes and plots and even those perspectival lines that govern the scenery all centered and converged on the figure of the monarch himself, seated in the middest place in Banqueting House in Whitehall or in some other rich interior. He was not a performer in these events, but his physical and political centrality in the production represented royal autocratic control. So in the masks we have music and poetry in the service of power. A chest of viols literally refers to a box or case designed to hold 6 viols, like that one. But it also came to mean the standard consort lineup, which we have here, of 2 trebles, 2 tenors, and 2 basses. Just as the word orchestra, originally part of the stage, came to mean the musicians who played there. The golden age of viol consort music began roughly in the 1620s and coincides with the end of the halcyon period of James I's rule. Although England's troubles were already brewing, James reaped the benefits of Elizabeth's hard-won political and religious settlement. He foiled the gunpowder plot that would have killed him and most of his parliament, and he then died conveniently before the severe fractures and tensions in religious culture spiraled out of control during the inept reign of his son Charles I. The Jacobean period was also one in which the mercantile genius of England's middling sort found its feet, grew prosperous and powerful, and thrived on religious toleration. The Consort of Viols expresses that condition musically. Roger North describes the consort as a musical republic in which all bore an equal share, and carrying the same air, there was no reason to choose one part before another. Thomas Mace admired the equality of the instruments, played upon as no part was any impediment to the other. Each part amplified and heightened the other. The rise later in the century of the violin dissolved that republic and placed the lower viols in subservience to it. In North's testy description of this development, the dominant violinist is obviously a sullen and egotistical diva. He's very rude about violinists. That metaphor of a republic dissolved and the rise of a dictatorial treble part is highly pertinent to these times. Between about 1630 and 1649, Charles's imposition of autocratic demands on the country led to chaotic personal rule, civil wars, and ultimately regicide. But where Charles lost his head, the violinist fared much better. Although some of the works we've been hearing were originally songs, the ascent of the viol, and especially the consort of viols, meant that much was transcribed for this most popular of ensembles. And many songs and madrigals of the 17th century are viol settings of song tunes without voice. In this sense, the viols themselves become eloquent. Now we're about to listen to Peter Phillips's setting of the Aria Granduca, a popular Italian song that was heard all over Europe. And after that, we'll hear a setting of Go From My Window, a well-known 16th century song about the forbidden nighttime visit of a lover. Here, an absolute barn burner by Orlando Gibbons.